Welcome everybody back to another episode of the All People's Health Collective podcast. I'm Carolina Valle, and um, I'm really excited for today, both to introduce myself as a member of APHC, as a guest host today, as the director of power building at Disability Rights California, um, and as a comrade of Kecia, who's going to be our guest today, um, talking about our fight against SB 258. So yeah, I guess I'll give a little bit of an introduction for you, Kecia, and then we can dive right in. I have to say, like, effusive about you joining today's podcast because you and I, along with other members of APHC, including Lex Stepling, and other colleagues at DRC, just finished a pretty grueling series of confrontations in an effort to kill SB 258, confrontations with people and organizations promoting and advocating for SB 258, as well as undermining the efforts to kill it as well. And, just so the audience knows and listeners know, we've come to know each other fairly recently, Kecia, although we're both lifelong Angelenos, if that's not obvious based on the hat I'm wearing right now. But I feel very kind of close to you in this work because having gone through this series of confrontations and this fight over the last summer to defeat 258, there really was nobody who showed more kind of radical conviction around the rights of disabled people than you, and nobody who really had as much stamina in that fight and who held the line as hard as you did. And I was reflecting in advance of today's call the reality that most of us doing or participating in these fights have some kind of, institutional backing, if you will. Meaning we have a home at an organization. And you were part of this fight really as a standalone kind of advocate and self-advocate. And so, just really grateful for you to join today's podcast. Thankful for everything that you've done over the last few weeks. And we've had several other guests talk about SB 258, the context and the history around it over the summer. And so folks are probably familiar generally with the issue, but want to hear from you directly, how you stepped into the fight against SB 258 and what your analysis of SB 258, what you see it is really about.
Thank you, Carolina. I am so excited to be part of this podcast today. I got involved with the fight against SB 258 at the beginning of July, I think, where Disability Rights California contacted me because I'm a nationally recognized sexual violence survivor and an advocate for prevention of sexual violence against people with intellectual developmental disabilities. From now on, IDD. I have expertise in consenting for sexual relations. I strongly oppose SB 258 because it would criminalize people with IDD having consensual sexual relations with people that SB 258 considers incapable of giving consent due to their disabilities. The California Sheriff's Association and the California District Attorney Association are both supportive of SB 258. For for Disability Rights California and myself, having these two organizations in support of S 258 is a huge red flag. Both organizations are not trustworthy to do the right thing when it comes to presuming that people with IDD have capacity to give legal consent when they engage in sexual relations with someone. SB 258 is a bill introduced in February 2025 by Senator Wahab that aims to remove the spousal exception in the California Penal Code definition of rape, specifically the exception that clearly applies when a person is unable to give legal consent to a mental disorder, developmental, or physical disability. SB 258 abundantly reinforces discriminatory assumptions about the capacity of individuals with IDD to consent to sexual relations, which is fundamentally mistaken. Individuals with IDD are sexual human beings possessing the inherent ability to make informed decisions about their own bodies and personal relationships. It's crucial to recognize that Senate Bill 258 has its roots in the California eugenics movement, which was characterized by extreme ableism. The movement advocated for further state control over the bodies and lives of disabled individuals, perpetuating the discriminatory belief that non-disabled individuals regard people with disabilities as inferior human beings. This discriminatory belief system is fundamentally flawed and has no place in our society.
Kecia, you, I think, encapsulated how deeply, um, not just problematic SB 258, but the fact that you saw a coalition of prosecutors, law enforcement, as well as so-called feminist groups coalesce around SB 258. You started at the top talking about and naming them as the backers of SB 258. And I remember when we first met in July, when we talked about who was authoring SB 258, Senator Wahab, who was writing SB 258, Michelle Dauber, and this triage, as Lex spoke to before on a previous episode, of these truly kind of villainous law enforcement characters. I don't know if you remember, but I recall you saying immediately, without even looking at the details of the language, that it was a non-starter for you in terms of negotiating at all to do, quote unquote, what a lot of other organizations did, in contrast to DRC, which was an effort to mitigate the harm of SB 258. And I appreciate you also naming your work as an advocate for women and for people who've experienced violations, right? And I think there's the 258 fight, which we're talking about today, but there's also your long history of work on the issue of sexual violence and sexual autonomy and freedom of disabled people. And people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, which is really why you were, I think, uh, um, identified as really the leader on this particular issue. And I guess, as you were speaking, I was curious to ask about, when you think back, and I know not a lot of time has passed, Kecia, but when you think back on this 258 fight, that purported to protect the rights of people who had experienced sexual violence, but in fact um, undermines the sexual autonomy of disabled people. Do you see it as part of a broader struggle to a broader struggle on who gets to define um, the freedom and dignity of disabled people?
Oh, definitely. I personally feel that it's a broader movement to help to prevent people with IED and other disabilities from having sexual autonomy, respect, and free will of our sexual wills to do what we want with our bodies. And with the capacity, these district attorneys, judges, benefits organizations, they are all connected together, and I call this as cardinal feminism. And with that is not good for anybody, because these organizations with the cardinal feminism, they want to undermine people with disabilities autonomy and our right to consent to have sexual relations with the other human being, because a lot of stereotypes, a lot of people think that because we have disabilities we're asexual, meaning that we don't want sex, and that can't be further from the truth, because as people with human beings, since we're also human beings like everybody else, we are sexual beings, and we enjoy sex like everybody else. And so by this cardinal feminism, with the district attorneys, these feminine organizations, and other disability rights organizations purporting Senate Bill 258, they are saying that we are firmly in the eugenics movement. We want to control people with disabilities and punish them for having disabilities.
Thank you, Kecia, for pointing to the thing that I think is sort of can be obvious, but is also not spoken to enough, which is this idea that people, that we all are sexual creatures and that we all have sexual desires. Um, and, as you were talking, it was making me think about how, particularly in the disability rights space, there's even hierarchies of whose voices get listened to around dignity and choice and capacity, and who is an authority of their own experience and who has the capacity to consent. And prior to joining the kind of disability rights space, I was unaware that there were these hierarchies of whose voices were prioritized. And what became very clear to me over the last several months was that even within the disability rights space, people with IDD are not viewed as authorities on their own experience. Um, and it's actually very similar, I think, to the experience of people who have mental health conditions as well. Kind of similar dynamics that, because you have IDD or because you have a mental health condition, your reality or your perspective is somehow distorted. And therefore others need to determine for you um, what your um, what your world should look like and who you need to be protected from. And it looks a couple different ways too, because on the one hand, I think in the context of XB258, where the paradigm was, there are victims and there are perpetrators, and we need to go after perpetrators of sexual violence. That was the whole framing by Senator Wahab and the supporters of SB 258. And we also need to protect the victims. And you spoke earlier about how people with IDD are infantilized or characterized as asexual.
Children,
What was that?
children.
As children. And then there's the other spectrum too, where they're characterized or having sexual needs or sexual desires is characterized as like deviant, right? Or dangerous. And so it's like both ends of the spectrum, right? And so, this idea kind of shows up in a couple different ways where you need to be protected from violence, but you're also, as Lex has spoken to before on previous episodes, folks with IDD are also the people that end up on death row and are the people who end up most likely having to live with wrongful convictions, right? And so the same kind of system that SB 258 is promoting, it both promotes your incapacity to make decisions, but it also promotes the criminality of people with IDD as well. And that actually, even though one of the talking points we heard from promoters of SB 258 and even some of the organizations that engaged in negotiations, even though people were saying this affects a very small population of people, which we know is not true, even if we go along with that line of thinking, we're talking about very serious, life or death consequences here. And so, I guess I'm wondering now, kind of even as we talk about kind of these assumptions and these stereotypes about people, do you feel like these assumptions are less about kind of disability itself and more about our society's fear of dealing with complexity and dealing with what are very real, ethical dilemmas, particularly as it relates to people who, are treated as kind of less valuable?
Yes, definitely. Because as you were talking, Carolina, I know that society is so scared and so fearful of dealing with the complexity of helping and supporting people with intellectual developmental disabilities, and 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 unfortunately for us, most of society is extremely ableistic, meaning that people, non-disabled people, or as I like to call them, TABs, temporary able bodies, people are saying to us, "Oh, just because you have a disability, you're less valuable than we are, because since we don't have any disabilities, we're superior." This just like um somebody saying to us, look, you don't have capacity to give consent for sexual relations because we're not disabled. We have the authority to make decisions on your behalf because people with disabilities are not good people. You're inferior human beings. And it's very, very frustrating that people have these stereotypes for people with disabilities, like like because I'm disabled, I don't have the capacity to give consent for sexual relations. I mean, that's total nonsense. Everybody has different capacities. And so with me, I have total capacity because I understand the sexual consequences of having sexual intercourse with somebody. But somebody else may have the capacity to understand, but not fully the consequences of having sexual relations with somebody. But my point being is that everybody has some sort of capacity to give consent for sexual relations. And what I really don't like about Senate Bill 258 is that is mainlining these stereotypes about people with IDD, like we're inferior, and people with IDD, we get to be infantilized, that we're treated like children, and that we need courts authority. We need district attorneys and feminist organizations to have to make control decisions over our body autonomy and our consent, our right for sexual relations, and other stereotypes. And on the far end, like you were saying, Carolina, on the far side, they're saying that because we're people with disabilities, we don't have the right to control our autonomy. And Senate Bill 258, they want to punish us and over criminalize people with IDD by the California Sheriff's Department Association and the District Attorneys Association. They're both in it supporting Senate Bill 258. And that's a huge red flag for Disability Rights California and definitely for myself because I don't trust either organization to help people with IUDs best interests at heart, especially in a court of law. And with the court of law, the district attorney just wants to prosecute. And so even though that the service department, like let's say if somebody other than the couple involved, and it could be two people with IUD having consensual relations. Let's say if there's a other group like a parent that disapproves of the sexual relations between these two people, they call the search department and the person with IUD gets arrested, and then they go into a court of law and the DA wants to prosecute the person with IUD for having a sexual relations with somebody. It's very, very frustrating because then they enter the criminal justice system without any of the supports. And I just totally am uh, upended about what SB 258 wants to do against people with disabilities.
Kecia, Thanks for painting just really clearly how this would play out inside the courtroom for people. Um, I think a lot of folks imagine that uh, once something like capacity gets defined on paper, it's going to play out with good intentions inside the courtroom. And as you described, it will um, not only reinforce any victimization that happened to the quote unquote, if you even want to go with that framework, person who was hurt, but it also victimized anybody who is accused. And again, we know um, the high rates of wrongful convictions among people with IDD. And so it's really not going to uh, it is not a well-intended piece of legislation at all. And I also, you said from the beginning, Kecia, that this bill was unfixable and unamendable. And I want to talk now about the role of other nonprofit organizations and what you observed what you observed about how they moved in this fight against SB 258. You said from the beginning this bill was unfixable. You said it was unamendable. You also said that there was nothing about capacity that should be up for negotiation and that it should be presumed full stop. And yet, the deal that a group of nonprofit organizations in the disability rights space and in the criminal justice space, the deal that they cut with Senator Wahhab's office hinged precisely on this idea of capacity and defining capacity. But you said if it is to be presumed, then it is not to be discussed or bargained away. And so can you talk about what it was like from your perspective to watch Senator Wahhab, Michelle Dauber, disability rights and criminal justice organizations negotiate this concept of capacity and ignoring you and your involvement in the process?
Yes, definitely. Because for one thing, from the onset, Senator Wahab herself didn't even in didn't even start with with the with the population of people with IUD who this bill definitely affects. She didn't even involve us from the very beginning. In like I want to say, the disability model, nothing bothers without us. If the bill affects our lives in some way, we need to be involved. We have to be involved from the very beginning. And with and with these sheriff association, DA association, Senator Wahab, and the professor, I definitely think that in the disability rights organizations that had a supporting view and actually negotiated with Wahhab's office, I mean, it's total nonsense because they are totally disrespecting people with IUD. I mean, they're saying that our voices are nonsense. Our particular voices in this fight against 258 is essential because it affects us. And in myself, I am the lead for Disability Rights California because I have lived experience with having IDD. I'm a very strong advocate. And even though that I'm the team lead with DRC against 258, my voice was totally rejected by these disability rights organizations. And with one consult the DRC team had with one particular disability rights organization, they totally start to bully everybody on the call and saying, "Oh, you're ignorant. You don't have a voice here." And I definitely respect DRC team for wanting to fight this horrible bill of Senate Bill 258. A other disability organization, and I wrote a white paper on this. I called them both out. These people, I noted in their mission statements, they promote that they support people with IDD in their interests, but by sponsoring Senate Bill 258, they're no longer walking the walk. In actuality, they're throwing people with IDD underneath the bus, and they're trampling on us. And they're saying that our voices are not valuable. Our voices are not important. And I am just a total nonsense because I know as a disability rights leader and a sexual violence prevention advocate that our voices matter at all times.
Kecia, you are making me think about one of the um, dynamics that played out in these fights against other, so-called disability rights organizations in this space, um, around what happens when people with IDD and people with disabilities are infantilized. What happens is others, and you talked about this in the example you presented, people who have more resources, more money, more class status get to dictate the policies and programs purporting to serve people with IDD. So in nonprofit spaces, class actually shows up because it's those types of families who have the time and the resources to set the priorities of those organizations while others are left out, right? So you have professionals and staff and family members that are speaking for you, and a whole industry actually gets developed and designed based on the assumption that you need others to speak for you. And so again, we see how it is that it's not people with IDD that are getting to design these policies and programs, and it's certainly not poor people or poor women or poor men that are getting to design these policies and programs, and get to represent these nonprofit organizations, and build whole professions out of it, really. It's others who have the time and the resources to do that. And so it just makes me think about what it reveals about the role of class and power in nonprofit dynamics.
Yes, definitely. Just a moment. Yeah, the class and power dynamics in a nonprofit space is very, very difficult for people with disabilities because I know a lot of demographics like people with IED, the poor, women, communities of color. We do not have these resources at our disposal. Not like the power brokers of these nonprofit organizations. So it's very, very difficult for us as people with disabilities, people with IDD, to have our voices heard. Because I remember once upon a time I was on a nonprofit board of directors, and they had a couple of self-advocates on the board, people with IED, but only it was our involvement on the board of directors was only symbolic because because they needed to check that diversity, inclusion, and equity lens box, saying, "Oh yes, we included people with disabilities on our board." But the thing is that people with disabilities, their voices were tokenized, meaning that we didn't have any real influence, and our voices were co-opted out, meaning that with people like families and parent family advocates, other board of directors on the nonprofit board, they all took it upon themselves to speak for people with disabilities, which is total nonsense because people with disabilities would the we're your fellow human beings, and we all want to enjoy having influence on matters that affect us directly. Because this nonprofit board that I was on, it was the organization helping people with IUD get case management services. And so when when my voice has been tokenized, it's very, very difficult to overcome that big obstacle and get our voices met and get our voices heard. However, I just underwent a process with the state of California called the Master Plan for Developmental Services. I was on the stakeholder committee, and the Department of Developmental Services, DDS, made during the master plan process made a dedicated effort that all self-advocate voices were heard during the process. We were assigned our own facilitators so that we could understand the material of the master plan process. We also during the master plan meetings themselves, our facilitators were there to help us understand, and we were given our own right to voice our direct opinions on what would go into the master plan for development services using our own empowered voices. And no one could co co-opted our voices during this process. And so I wish that no more nonprofits like DDS was actually as a state agency would give light to the empowered voices of people with IUD in their government process.
I'm gonna have some of my beverage too, because I get a little bit hoarse. toward the end of these podcasts. Mine is just sugar water. Um, Kecia, you're pointing to something that I was thinking about before we hopped on today about, I mentioned at the top that unlike many of us who have a home at a nonprofit organization, and I know you do work as well in nonprofits, but in the context of the SB 258 fight, you were like you're a rogue agent. Um, and you didn't have that kind of, institutional or philanthropic support. And um, and you mentioned, tokenization and you talk about just now, like kind of what a what kind of good faith negotiations look like to you. And so in the context of SB 258, I mean, what was that, if you're kind of looking back on that and advising others that want to also do this work, I mean, how is it that you could tell, um, how can you tell when a negotiation is genuinely in good faith versus when it's not? And what are those kind of markers of inclusion? I don't want to say inclusion, but of government, and I know these are like big terms, but you saw in this fight that there was DRC and APHC and how we were conducting ourselves. And then you saw how legislators and Disability Rights and Education and Defense Fund and the ARC were conducting themselves. How were you able to discern, um, kind of who was genuine in their um, fight for people and who wasn't?
That's a great question, Carolina, because as you said, in the fight against Senate Bill 258, I am very much a rogue agent. I don't have any organization supporting me. I'm an individualist, and I like to team up with with DRC and also the community of the APHA group. And I could tell about good faith negotiations with these two groups because for one thing, they highlighted my lived experience, and they highlighted my expertise as an expert in consent. They highlight my expertise as a sexual assault prevention advocate, and that I know my stuff. I've been working in this capacity since 2012, and so my own experience was lived experience as a person with IUD was included, encouraged, highlighted, and with the other organizations like Arc of California and Dreaded, a bad faith negotiation is that they knew that I was in the room, the Zoom room, but my voice on both organizations fell flat because they saw my presence as a non-starter, that I was an inferior human being. As a person with IUD, I'm inferior, and they totally discounted whatever I said, and so in opposition to Senate Bill 258. And especially when I connected with both organizations and I said my piece opposing Senate Bill 258. They said that they were going to they said that they were going to keep on negotiating with Senator Hobbs' office, even though that I told them not to, because Senate Bill 258 is not fixable, is not amendable. We should kill it outright. And these these two organizations of support, they totally discounted my opinions, my expertise on on these points. And so that's how I could tell from a good faith negotiation, good good faith negotiation. My own opinion has been highlighted, and it is also over. And I've been in the DRC side. I am the expert. I am the team lead. But a bad faith negotiation is that my viewpoints, my expertise are totally discounted, and it's very ableistic, and they're saying, you're inferior to us. We don't have to listen to you. Your voice is not important.
Thank you, Kecia. I was just having like a visceral kind of response to what you were saying, and recalling how real what you experienced was. Um, so now, the negotiations have proceeded. Amendments have been incorporated, SB 258, although not published publicly, despite this being in the realm of public policy. But we do know that SB 258, despite all of your objections, writes into law capacity. And capacity is presumed or assumed now by definition in the new set of amendments. But we know, as you've spoken to, that legal assumptions on paper don't always translate into autonomy in practice. And, having grown up around public defenders and prosecutors myself, my mom's been a clerk for the public defender's office here in LA County, throughout LA County for the last 30 years. I know all too well that laws that are supposed to be protective on paper fail in court. And so can you just drive it home for folks about why even assuming capacity on paper doesn't actually translate into promoting sexual autonomy for people with IDD in courtrooms?
Oh, definitely. I would love to answer that question for you, because for one thing, even though that it says uh, assumed capacity on paper, that does not translate into the courtroom, because because I know that district attorneys, judges, and other people in the courtroom with decision-making power, they all have their implicit biases against people with IDD. So their implicit biases and the explicit biases, it it transforms their own decisions, their legal decisions about people with IDD in the court of law. And so even though on paper it says assumed, in the courtroom, the paper is erased, because everybody is going going with their implicit biases against people with disabilities. And so in that way, judges and district attorneys are going to assume the latter, that people with disabilities are incapable of giving consent to sexual relations. And thus, people with disabilities, people with IED, are being criminalized for their assumes lack of consent, lack of capacity for consent for sexual relations. And these people with IED are going to be prosecuted to the letter of the law because of these implicit biases of DAs and judges. And then the people with IED are going to enter the criminal justice system wrongly accused of having lacking capacity of consent for sexual relations. And these people with IED entering the criminal justice system is going to be extremely traumatic for people. Because I just want to point out that when a person with IED goes into the criminal justice system, they typically don't get the support that they have in the actual world. Like with me, if I should go into the criminal justice system, I wouldn't have my support agency with me to help protect me. And and people with disabilities, all their supports go by the wayside. And a lot of people with IDE don't understand why they're being taken into the criminal justice system, especially if it was a consensual sexual relationship with somebody. They don't understand that. And so this it just because it says assumption on paper, assumption for capacity, it doesn't translate into the real world in the court system because of all these implicit biases of district attorneys and judges.
Thank you, Kecia. I really appreciate um, you driving that point home. Um, and I think we're getting close to time here. I think I could certainly talk to you for another hour about how far we have, or I should say, how far we haven't come in this kind of post-Me Too world, where I think, there may have been some um, greater kind of popular media visibility around instances of sexual violence, but those instances were really focused on, I think, a small group of very, very privileged um, women, which is nothing to say of poor women or poor men, and nothing to say of complexity and how that was flattened. Hours. So I would love for us to continue the conversation about how this example of SB 258 is really, I think, an important conversation starter about, whole categories of sexual expression, and how they remain criminalized and treated as risks to be managed. But maybe I'll leave that as a cliffhanger for another episode. We've had you on.
Oh, I definitely agree, Carolina. Leave it as a cliffhanger for future conversations.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Kecia, for joining us as just a true ride or die rogue agent. And thanks to Geronimo for setting us all up on the back end. All right.
It's my pleasure to be here.
All right. Take care.
Bye bye.